Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to our first edition of Pedia Online Poetry Festival, organized by Ideas in Progress in association with Padasala. Thank you all for being here. My name is Deepak. I'm the presenter of today's session. Pedia Online Poetry Festival, POP Festival, is an attempt to explore the versification practice of English poets of the day. In the four sessions in this first edition of the event, we have four poets in focus who shall be listened to, and we have four others who shall carry the conversation with those in focus. We will close each session with a reading of the poems by the guest poet who chairs the session. At the outset of this event, let me introduce the two organizations that have come together to make this event possible. Ideas in Progress and Padasala. Ideas in Progress, an organization that had been engaging with the society for over the past 20 years, helps to bring about spontaneity in expression by kindling the aesthetic sensibility within through a creative process. They open up opportunities to engage with artists from various fields, including poets, musicians, painters, sculptors, film and theater enthusiasts to share, nurture, guide, and motivate creative engagement. It thereby attempts to fill the ideological vacuum by spurring original thought in a critical endeavor. Renowned theater practitioner and founder of Abhinaya Theatre Group, Mr. Raghutaman, sculptor, painter, and retired principal of Fine Arts College, Mr. N.N. Brimson, National Award-winning Indian film critic and documentary filmmaker, Dr. C.S. Venkateshwaran, senior journalist and former chief of bureau of The Hindu, Mr. Gauridasan Nair, music therapist, performing artist, professional trainer in Hindustani music, and head of the Department of Philosophy in University College Trivandrum, Dr. T.K. Sunnitha, Malayalam poet and painter Mr. George, are only a few among the many who form this organization. In collaboration, we have with us Padasala, which is an informal collective of friends at Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, which was formed in 2015 to inspire, engage, and involve the academia with the society, thereby trying to bridge the gap formed due to differences of varied kinds. Our focus is on academic engagement, and therefore our target is creating brighter minds. It had always stood for making knowledge available for everyone. This venture is one such. Now I'm honored to invite the speaker poet of the day, Mr. Ravi Shankaran, popularly known as RaSh. RaSh has published 3 collections of poetry, Architecture of Flesh, The Bullet Train and Other Loaded Poems, and Kitsugi by Hadri. He has also published poems in many national and international online and print magazines and have been translated into German and French. He has co-translated Sri Lankan Tamil poems in a collection, Waking is Another Dream, and a collection of Malayalam Dalit stories, Don't Want Caste. Also, has he edited and translated a collection of 101 Malayalam poems, How to Translate an Earthworm. His collection of translated stories from Tamil, Ichi, Tree Monkey, and Other Stories, and a play, Blind Men Write, are in the pipeline. As the title of most of his poems indicate, he unites bitter irony with savage sarcasm in poems to pin down the truths we live with. Sir, I take this opportunity to welcome you to chair and interact with the poet in focus, unfurling her poetic journey, its philosophy, politics, and method to us. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce and welcome the poet in focus of the first day of our event, Ms. Sumana Roy. Mrs. Sumana Roy writes from Siliguri, a small town in sub-Himalayan Bengal, India. Her book, How I Became a Tree, published in 2017, mixes memoir, literary history, nature studies, spiritual philosophies, and botanical research to give us a new vision of what it means to be human in the natural world. This is what makes her unique in her approach to versification as well. She is a writer whose poems and short stories have appeared in Granta, Buff Roy's Poetry at Sangam, Cha, an Asian Literary Journal, Priory Schooner, Asia Writes, Pratilipi, and elsewhere. Her essays include everything from a celebration of rhododendrons in the hills to an analysis of why the popular Dam Lagaye Ke Haishi isn't as empowering as people think. An early draft of her novel, Love in the Chicken's Neck, was longlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize, but Sumana chose not to publish it because she was dissatisfied with the story. Ma'am, this shall remain too little a description of your work, and we are honored to have you with us in this event as our first poet in focus. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
My first book, which Deepak just introduced, or whatever in my bio, I was trying to look at how it might feel for a human to live like a tree. The poems that I've written since then, in the poems that I've written since then, I find that my journey has just been the opposite about what it might feel for plants and trees, for plant life to enter the human social world. So one of the first poems where I now retrospectively, of course, find that this has happened is a poem called I Want to Be a Tree. I want to be a tree. I know that this desire lives outside the curriculum. Irrationality is man's favorite home. One man's love is another's superstition. I am the tree that wears passion's baggy clothes. My hair soaks fear. My leaves the planet's poison air. There is memory, always half-eaten. And there is sleep, inevitably rural. There's also sunlight, always a neighbor. It's summer, and so the road's deathless fever. I want to be a tree, as naturally branched as the body's posture in sleep. To woo birds, they avoid men and motion to sit on trees. I'm leaning against a statue of sunlight. The wind affects us unequally. I wonder why tree branches do not behave like curtains in the wind, or why we fail to hear creepers knocking at the door. I want to be a tree. The wind escaped being written. The fire's autograph, the shriveled sunlight on trees. Seasons arrive like prompters in a play. The trees perform without the need to pluck flaps. I am an extra filling out the frame. Paint, cycles, the spiky heads of moss, the menstrual stillness, and the piracy of affection. I want to be a tree, air a doll between my leaves, fair as inconsequential as mimicry. Only blood needs religion, and so there is none among plants. Only love, as accommodative as a paragraph. Love needn't be reciprocal. How else can we love the dead? The earth loses ownership of dead trees. I imagine my funeral sometimes. You, for whom the guitar is an integer of sadness. You, who thought I was invincible like crushed paper, saying, my world has lost its chlorophyll. So here's the poem called Jackfruit, which Ravi has very kindly translated. It's a short poem. Jackfruit. This is not a fruit. It is the Buddha's head. Dots, mounds, spikes, his curls, as in the Gandhara statues. When the skull cracks open, Smell stretches its legs. Flies panic, overdose on bushy sweetness. That voluptuous yellow, sweetened light, large-cheeked sweetness, as if sweetness was a muscle. Why is our blood salty, but theirs sweet? Juice, as viscous as fever, never unreluctant to pause, to stick. The seeds emerge out of the fibrous pulp, like bodhisattvas, slippery but sincere. Not yet monk, not yet saint, just anesthetized by wonder, unsure whether life was a second-hand thing. Thank you, Ravi. Now your turn.
Thank you, Sumana. Now, shall I read out the Malayalam translation?
Yeah,
for the
that would be
Malayalis
great.
here.
Yes,
Yeah.
that would be great.
I think Shyam Sudhakar, a poet, has entered the meeting just now. I saw him entering.
Mm-hmm.
He has another poem of yours translated, and I think later he can also read it out.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'll read out my translation of Jackfruit as Chakka. Jackfruit
Okay.
is the national fruit of Kerala. So,
Mm-hmm.
Jackfruit, Chakka, Sumana Roy. ഒഴിമാറ്റം RaSh. ഇത് വെറുമൊരു ഫലമല്ല, ബുദ്ധന്റെ ശിരസ്സാണ്. പുള്ളിക്കുത്തുകൾ, പൊള്ളങ്ങൾ, മുള്ളുകൾ, ഗാന്ധാര പ്രതിമകളെപ്പോലുള്ള മുടിച്ചുരുടുകൾ. തലയോട് പിളരുമ്പോൾ സുഗന്ധം മൂരി നിവരുന്നു. കാടുപിടിച്ച മധുരത്താൽ ഈച്ചകൾ പരിഭ്രമിക്കുന്നു. മത്തു പിടിക്കുന്ന മഞ്ഞ, മത്തു പിടിപ്പിക്കുന്ന മഞ്ഞ, മധുര വെളിച്ചം, വീർത്ത കവിളുകളുടെ മാധുര്യം, മധുരം ഒരു മാംസപേശിയാണെന്നതുപോലെ. പനി പോലെ ഘനസാന്ദ്രമായ നീര്, ഒഴുകാനോ പറ്റിപ്പിടിക്കാനോ മടിയില്ലാത്തത്. നമ്മുടെ ചോരയ്ക്ക് ഉപ്പ് രസവും ഇവയ്ക്ക് മധുരവും കൈവന്നതെങ്ങനെ? നാരുകൾ നിറഞ്ഞ മാംസക്കുഴമ്പിൽ നിന്നും പിറവികൊള്ളുന്ന വിത്തുകൾ ബോധിസത്വന്മാരെ പോലെ വഴുതിയാലും ആത്മാർത്ഥതയുള്ളവർ, ഇനിയും സന്യാസിയായിട്ടില്ലാത്തവർ, വിശുദ്ധരാകാത്തവർ, അത്ഭുതത്താൽ മരുവിച്ചവർ, ജീവിതം ഇരുവട്ടം കൈമാറിയതാണോ എന്ന് തീർച്ചയില്ലാത്തവർ. അതാണ് ജാക്ക് ഫ്രൂട്ട് എന്ന കവിത മലയാളത്തിൽ. Any more poems to be read, Sumana, which you would like to read?
Let me read a poem that is close to where I am right now, and that has kind of affected the way I have seen life. I live in a small town called Shiliguri in northern Bengal. It's sub-Himalayan Bengal, and through most of my childhood, in this quite unremarkable town, it was the Kanchanjanga that, that was almost like a parent raising us. It would follow us everywhere when we went to school. I cycled to school, and I would be there. It would be there when I went to collect, the dried clothes from the terrace with my mother. Growing up, and my first job was in a place called Darjeeling, where I taught undergraduates at Darjeeling Government College. And there my experience of the Kanchanjanga was slightly different. I think our experience of places changes as we move from childhood to adulthood. So perhaps this poem is, though it's called Kanchanjanga, it might be a little more about myself than it is about the poem. So I apologize than it is about the Mount, Mount Kanchanjanga, sorry. So I apologize for this piece of self-indulgence. It's called Kanchanjanga. My eyes are cloudier than the day. cloudier than time, than disease. In my throat, the mountains and their requests to move. Sadness lays eggs easily, its reproductive cycle like an insect's. I wipe my eyes again, as if these tears were blankets I was folding for a future season. In front of me are backs of heads, as if the Kanchanjanga were a painting, and Padasala Loop a museum. Over their heads, I expect to see it, like a letterhead, but it's not there. My body's absorbed my heart like blotting paper. I crouch in pain. I'm about to burst, as if I were a pipe whose waters solidified. Sadness feels like that. Hard. A hardening of what once was soft, liquid and delightful, like love or dread. The Kanchanjanga doesn't appear. There's disappointment. It's as if the mountain hasn't kept an appointment. Umbrellas open like rusty guns. They carry the crowd like boats. And soon as the rain grows fluent, ant-like drops stab the skin like ambulances without adjectives. Wet, like a request, I sit by a culvert. I wait, like a utensil collecting water that has no use. This too will harden inside me like the icy peaks of Kanchanjanga. Sadness always finds its tourists. Yeah, Ravi, let me stop reading now, and
Yeah.
if anyone or if you want me to read later, I definitely will.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I often find in your writings this constant preoccupation with trees. By trees, you mean the elements of nature and how you associate with nature rather than this civilized nature of things. So there are two ways in which your poetry or writings are traveling. One is preoccupation with nature and one with academia uh, in a more academic kind of thought and process. I found today on the Facebook we had put a visual of a leaf floating on the river. Your nephew, your constant companion, your nephew had put this visual. Actually, it's very interesting how you put it. And the leaf is floating on the water, and suddenly comes into view the reflection of the tree on the water, and the leaf seems to travel towards it and wants to merge with it. So it's a sort of it wants to return to the tree. The dead leaf wants to become the tree. I think it has something to do with your kind of thought process, like your book, How I Became a Tree, in which you did not become a tree, but now in your poem says that you have in fact become a tree. So your first book, I Became a Tree, was a process towards becoming a tree.
Yes.
I think so. So can you talk something about that book?
Thank you, Ravi. I remember your very sweet and kind and completely RaSh-like post, so unique to you, about how I became a tree. There are very few people I haven't met yet to whom I have been able to kind of open myself up to, and you are one of them. It's because of your peculiar sense of humor. I find that I gravitate towards people who make me laugh, and you are one of them, without a doubt. I feel sad that I haven't been able to meet you in person yet. Um, to talk about how I became a tree, it seems so long ago. I might be making a bit of it up in my head if I speak about it now, but because you've asked me to. I remember this coming from a place of...
How much time did you take on that? How many years you spent on that? Because it's a large book.
I really don't know, because we are also writing when we are not writing. I mean, even as I'm speaking to you, or you are speaking to me, and I see now the wonderful comments that so many of our Facebook friends, people I know from Facebook, such sweet comments that make my day, particularly because I haven't been well today, as Chandra Mohan knows. So even when I read their comments and they are writing their comments, I just think that we are writing all the time. A few weeks ago, it might have been October, my mother reminded me, and this was around 2004, and I was going through a period of extreme sadness. It's easy to use these phrases retrospectively, but only one who's gone through this understands how insufficient language is to convey the emotions that one is going through or one has been through. So my mother reminded me that around 2004, I had asked her, Ma, what do you think? I'd asked her this in Bangla. Do you think it is better to be a seed? Is it better to be a seed or a root? And my mother was, surprised by, she calls me Pagli, which is the word for mad girl. So she thought it was one of my Pagli questions. When people ask me, how long have you been writing this book? I really don't know, Ravi, because it's possible I have been writing this for all my life, throughout my life. But if you ask me about when I became conscious of writing this, it would be, I think, around 2013 and 14. Again, it came from a place of sadness, of my need to move out of the human social, by which I mean to think of a life or to imagine a life outside the system of reciprocity or reciprocal emotions that make or that annotate our understanding of romantic relationships, of all kinds of relationships. And I thought to myself, who do I want to live like? I thought, I don't have what I'm going to say is, and I should say this with a kind of trigger warning, but so I'm just saying this, said it's impossible for me to kill myself. I will have to find a way to live. And what do I live like? I knew that the life of a human wasn't for me anymore. I thought, do I want to live like a dog? And anyone who's lived with a dog knows that the dog is not outside the emotion economy. When you come back from work, the dog is waiting for us at home. It was summer and the ceiling fan was switched on above my head. And I remember this distinctly. And I thought, okay, maybe not a dog, maybe not an animal, then maybe I would want to live like a ceiling fan. By which I mean none of this was literal, but a metaphorical borrowing from that way of life. And suddenly it struck me that to live like a ceiling fan, I would need to lose all agency. I would become dependent on someone to turn on the fan or to switch it off. Years passed like this, and suddenly it struck me that I wanted to live like a tree, because to me, and in this I was foolish as I understand it, it was stupid of me to think that, a tree is outside the emotion economy. But I latched on to that metaphor just for sustenance. hoping that it would allow me to live. Again, years passed, and I thought to myself, why does this thought about not living like about living like a tree not leave me? And I thought, am I the only quote unquote abnormal person who feels this way? And then I began to look for people who had, if there were people at, who had experienced similar feelings of wanting to live like a tree. And then I was surprised, whether it was Siddhartha who became the Buddha sitting under a tree, or a favorite thinker, Jagadish Chandra Bose, who discovered about 100 years ago that plants were quote unquote living beings. So to discover artists, filmmakers, spiritual and philosophical thinkers, and ordinary people like myself who had wanted to become a tree or live like a tree. So this book is about finding intellectual and emotional relatives, not only about myself, but also them who wanted to live like a tree, Ravi.
Yeah, in the book at some stage, you write about becoming a shadow.
Yeah.
I'll read out that portion.
Thank you.
In the evening, I let my shadow out on the field. There my limbs and its shadows work to their own logic. And on a few lucky days, when the angle and the light and everything else fell into synchronic alliance, I saw my shadow turning into a tree with branches, a tree waiting for leaves. I had still not managed to become a tree, but I had at least become its shadow. So this was the portion which I liked. That's what I asked you about it.
Yeah.
And again, the final chapter is, of course, about how I became a tree, the way you end it.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, you are still not a tree.
Yeah.
Even now, you are not a tree.
As you
I have
can see,
also
I
been
didn't
writing about.
succeed. Sorry, please go
Yeah.
ahead.
No. Continue.
I said, as you can see, I haven't clearly succeeded in becoming a tree. I have realized, particularly during the lockdown, I used to, because I've had such a solitary, how do I say, solitary, emotional, and even intellectual life, because of the way I was raised and because of my natural temperament, I used to feel that I am no longer dependent on people, or a sense of community to nourish me. This also comes from my position, geographical and mental, um, and intellectual, in the place that I'm writing from. Indian English poetry, as you know, Ravi, has become, in spite of it being a space where there are 500 poets and only 400 readers, there are so many groups and coteries that seem to be fighting with one another. Uh, it's and whereas poetry is supposed to do the opposite, bring us all together. Uh, you know, trying to learn this foreign language, which gives us so much joy, which is what I think of as poetry. Uh, in spite of that, this has become such a quarrelsome and bickering space, and I'm a complete outsider to this space, whether it is poetry or prose. So and I I say this not with any kind of moral superiority or pride, but from a sense of disappointment and sadness. I think a lot of I look at Bangla literature and its literary history, and I see that there have been feuds and literary quarrels, but there has also been a great spirit where people have been able to see outside themselves. And I find that spirit lacking in most of us. including perhaps myself. And this space of the outsider has allowed me to protect myself, perhaps protect my, I'm going to use an old-fashioned word, protect my soul and my writing and my life. I'll just read your comments, Mandakini and Konika, in a bit. Thank you. But also, you know, this space of being independent, that Ravi, I like your earthworm collection, but it's possible that I might not like what you write after this, and I should have the intellectual honesty and responsibility to tell you that I don't like this particular poem that you've written, and you should not take it to heart. Similarly with other responses, but that feedback machinery, the culture of reviewing in India has become so dishonest, or perhaps always was. I was too outside it to even notice it. So all of that, but and I used to think that I've been able to protect myself from the need for community. But the lockdown, you know, since March, has made me understand that I was very, very wrong. We do need a sense of community, particularly, and for this I mean a community of the senses, more than, you know, anything else. The need to touch, to smell, to taste, to hug, all of these. I have missed, apart from seeing my parents and nephew and niece, I've been at home and not seen anyone else. So I have missed that during the lockdown. I see questions from Konika. Could you please elaborate on your concept of the emotion economy? Konika, I had been through a space where I felt that the need for reciprocity, or reciprocal, you know, emotions was bound to leave us, anyone, the human, perhaps also the animal, though I know so little because I'm only a human, limited by my body and mind and everything else. I felt that this also came to me not from only my desire to be a tree. The reason I read out I want to be a tree is we love the dead, those who've left us, but we are not sure whether they continue to love us. So is it possible that we could have relationships like these, where we are, you know, able to take ourselves to that emotional space? It's not to live like a saint, but just to be able to condition ourselves in that particular way. Maybe I will speak to you in private about this, because I'll end up speaking a lot more than we have time for. Yes, Mandakini, I completely agree with you. Yeah, absolutely, listening. I couldn't agree more. Thank you. Big hug to you for this. Yeah, if anyone else, Ravi, you wanted to say something? I've been just blabbering. Please go ahead.
Excuse
No,
me.
I wanted to read out another portion from your book.
I think Deepak wants to say something. Deepak or Chandra Mohan, I can't see either.
It was I who said excuse me.
Yes.
There was one more question in the chat box.
Yes.
Parveen Saket had asked, has Han Kang's novel, The Vegetarian, influenced your ideas or work in any way?
No, whose question is this, please? May I know?
Parveen Saket.
Oh, hi, Parveen, you're here. No, Parveen, I read this, I think 2.5 years after How I Became a Tree was published. After students at Ashoka, I didn't know about this book. I mean, that's my lack of education. Students began telling me that, Professor, you should read this book. And then I wrote about reading this book also. So it was only after I had written How I Became a Tree that I found out. Chandra Mohan is a master of the longer poem. I'd rather, I'd be grateful if no one else, you know, if I wasn't called master. I have a problem with the word master and masterpiece because it excludes my gender and anyone outside the male gender, trans people, people like myself, women, and all of us. So, am I a master of the longer poem? If I exclude the word master, if I could substitute this with, am I fond of the longer poem? I used to be. That was a different phase in my life. Now I think also those poems that are in out of syllabus, I think, are overwritten, and I now wish I hadn't published them. So I find that I rely more on the shorter poem now, Chandra Mohan.
I think this short paragraph is a poem.
Thank you, Ravi.
From you, from this book, though it's not a poetry book.
Mm-hmm.
Not until the bird came and sat on my shoulder around sunset one day. I did not move. I do not know about the bird, but I was certain that in the thinning margins of that forest in Baiguntapur, I was at last ready to be a tree. So this is how your book ends. And it's like almost like the end of a Tarkovsky film. Yeah, it's the way his films normally end. So we're summing up the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
About out of syllabus, I think I read another article by you in Los Angeles Book Review, that thing about academia and poetry.
Yeah.
And you were saying that the word poet is turned into a pejorative.
Yes, yes.
By academia.
Yeah.
He is a kavi, they say, mocking the person. Mm-hmm. Creative writing is understood as a thing that requires little intelligence. Yeah. Only heart is enough. Mm-hmm. I think the poems from out of syllabus, you deliberately chose this title. And ironically, all the poems are put under chapters named after the topics you're taught in the school, like English, biology, mathematics, and one poem which you're having. Yeah. I thought it was a nice way of putting it. But can you elaborate something about this article in Los Angeles Book Review?
Thank you, Ravi, for remembering.
You're talking about institutional hierarchy.
Yes, but also otherwise, that wasn't there, I think, until the 20th century. So my argument has been, so this came from a place, I teach at the Department of Creative Writing in Ashoka, at Ashoka University, a small liberal arts university in Haryana, in a place called Sonipat, that's close to, that's almost like a suburb of Delhi.
Yeah, I think our poet Hussein Pandit is also teaching there.
Okay.
Okay, carry on.
Yeah, so I don't have an MFA, a degree. My degree is in English literature. I studied in Shiliguri. My degree is from a place here which doesn't understand creative writing as a discipline. So when I got this job, and for 14 and a half years, I taught literature in a government college setup. When I got this job at Ashoka University, I really didn't know how to teach creative writing because I had not gone through the same routine. And I realized that the only way, and this came to me from my love of music and for having trained in it for a few years, though I can't sing to save my life, is that to be a singer, one has to learn to be a listener first. The whole idea of srota and sruti, as we know. So what I decided was I would read with my students. I would find ways of reading with them which would inform their practice. So I would share things that had come to me as a practitioner. So that is how I continue to teach. Then one day, my head of the department, Professor Jonathan Gill Harris, asked me to address a pro-seminar group, which is an advanced group of advanced students who are writing their fourth-year thesis, saying, you must tell them that there is no difference between the creative and critical. So it's something that had been on my mind for a really long time. So I sat down and began to write this talk, and which was eventually published a year after I had, not year, but about 9 or 10 months after I had first spoken about it. It came from a place, again, all my writing comes from my experience of the world. It came from a place of being bullied, Ravi. I am married to an academic who teaches literature, whose interest is in philosophy, Anglo-American philosophy, Francophone philosophy, critical theory. And I found that in places such as, I live in a provincial town, and in places like ours, but also in metropoles, there is a tendency now, post the Second World War, to underestimate creative writers. At one point of time, up to the 19th century, and T.S. Eliot, when he writes Tradition and the Individual Talent, is forced to make a case for this. And I also quoted from J.C. Ransom, a new critic, one of my favorite writers, who's making a case for this, that up to the 19th century, this is not what they say, this is my argument, that up to the 19th century, so let me just paraphrase this very quickly. We think of God as, we say God the creator, we don't say God the critic, as if both could be divorced. Any creative work is simultaneous with the work of criticism. You are writing this, I'll say this for myself, I'm writing this essay because I'm arguing with something. Argument does not mean I'm quarreling with something. I'm trying to make a space for this idea or thought or philosophy that I believe in. When Virginia Woolf writes A Room of One's Own, she's trying to make a space for women writers to have, quote unquote, a room of their own, not only literally, but figuratively, in this body of what she understood as English literature. To imagine the figure of, this person as Shakespeare's sister, is to imagine a body of work that has been denied place in history, so on and so forth. Even someone like Ramchandra Guha, in one essay, he's quoting from Tagore on nationalism, and he says, even Rabindranath Tagore, a mere poet, and he goes on, as if a mere poet, to quote Ram Guha, is incapable of making an argument. So this difference between the creative and critical, that I see as a manifestation of a post-World War education economy, or an industrialization of education, so that we have separate departments, separate jobs. I do not believe in this distinction. So if I'm writing how I became a tree, and if I write I want to be a tree, it is coming from a place, from a critical tradition that goes back to Jagadish Chandra Bose, where he's arguing for plants or plant life to be called the living. So all our writing belongs to a certain tradition of argumentation. And I feel sad, particularly in provincial academic spaces, where I have heard lots and lots of colleagues dismissing another, saying, oh, he's a kavi, as if it's very easy to be a poet. For those of us who struggle to get one line or one sentence right, we know how difficult it is. So, this hierarchy that has been created is something that I find very disturbing.
Yeah, thank you. But can you please explain to me this one? It's very interesting. There's a poem titled Every Girl is Dinner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Remember that poem? Every Girl is Dinner.
Yeah, I will, Ravi. I'd also answer a part of the question that I didn't answer, which is I have a copy of out of syllabus with
One
me,
second.
like you do. Yeah. So you asked me
Oh,
about the segmentation or the
no,
different sections. Yeah. So in mathematics, history,
no,
chemistry. Sorry, please.
no, my question was poem titled "Every Girl Is Dinner."
Yeah.
Why did you put it under general knowledge? No.
Okay, I'll explain. And I also wanted to say that you asked me about naming the different sections after disciplines, as in mathematics or subjects taught in school. I was struggling to bring the poems together. And then I suddenly realized that the emotions from which these poems had come were out of syllabus. They were quote unquote illegitimate. And I realized that if I was putting them under these different rubrics or disciplinary rubrics or categories, none of these things are taught in school. You are not taught how to love. If I, when I broke my arm, upper arm, 4 years ago, I was given leave from work. But if I suffered heartbreak, I wouldn't be given leave. So, so these distinction, the privileging of the head over the heart, that seems to now be part of our post-enlightenment tradition. So in this essay that you mentioned that was published in the Los Angeles Review of Books, as you said, I said, why do we call this, so why do we call a person head of the department? Why are we so reluctant to call this person heart of the department? So this privileging, we are living through an extremely head-heavy culture. So, I have heard my parents fighting and my father saying, try to think through your head. Why do you not have logic when you discuss this, to my mother? So this hierarchy between male and female, between the head and the heart, all, and IQ and EQ, all these as if they could be separate from one another or from each other. These distinctions are completely useless to me. You mentioned every girl is dinner. As I say in the parenthetical kind of piece of information in the poem, I said this poem came from looking at a Facebook post by my Facebook friend called Swati Moitra, who saw this word in quotes, every girl is dinner, at the Vishwavidyalaya station at Delhi University. And on a green door was written, every girl is dinner in English, and below that the word dinner in Hindi. So dinner. For those of you who have Hindi, if you read the word backwards, you will see that the word dinner in Hindi, when read backwards, becomes randi. So every girl is dinner also becomes every girl is randi. So, this poem came from that place, that how a tradition of looking at women as always having been dinner for, a very male society, beginning from the goddess Kali and, Tara Pete and everyone. And, Shakti mills, Shakti Pete, then the Tandoor case that we know of, the woman becoming tandoor and so on. Yeah, so that I thought was general knowledge.
Yeah. At least Indian English writing is, you said there are 500 poets and 400 readers. So
I'm sorry.
no, you don't have to be sorry, because in Kerala we have 10,000 poets and 500 readers. So that situation is bad, worse here. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. I think it comes from a place of disappointment. I think we could have been a community that was supporting each other. Instead, I find such a lot of bickering, and this, particularly this year, which has been so hard on us. I just hope I know I will sound like a new age guru, particularly with my overgrown hair that can't be given any shape now. I know I'll sound like such a person, but only if we could be kind to each other. People go on and on about intelligence and poets being sensitive. Uh, I just think of kindness as the highest form of intelligence and also the highest form of common sense. Uh, yes, Parveen, I completely agree. I mean, even if we just reach out, I reach out to Parveen and Parveen reaches out to you and you reach out to Chandramohan and Chandramohan to someone else, there is going to be a circle of kindness. And, this economy of attention that has killed that has killed our souls in so many ways. I'm getting 14 likes, Ravi is getting 15 likes, Mandakini is getting 16 likes. As if we can use these likes for our pension funds. The dishonesty, that that has become all pervasive in our reviewing culture. Friends reviewing friends, or people who hate you reviewing your books and actually writing a character assassination or character certificate of you as a person instead of the book. That has always, so you mentioned creative and critical writing, Ravi. The reason for writing this was this, that my alignment with an understanding that came to me very naturally, that I was interested in the writing, never in the writer. So my internet connection is probably unstable. That's what they're telling me. I don't know whether you've been able to hear what I said. So I said my focus is on the text, on the piece of literature. So even if I don't like you very much, Ravi, and I do like you, my focus is on what you are writing, who you are. The reason I have not been able to socialize and become friends, quote unquote friends, with anyone from the writing world is just because of this. I have wanted to protect myself from dishonesty. Um, if I hear the sound of Mandakini's voice, it is possible that when I read her poems, and if I have to write a quote unquote review of her poems, I will become biased because I hear the sound of her, voice in it. So I've tried to protect myself from it. The reason I don't write reviews anymore, what I would like to definitely do, and I have continued to do this in the last 10 or 11 years since I've known you, Ravi, is write about our poems, but not review essays where reviewers behave like moral science teachers. People ask me, what are your favorite reviews? Um, After the third review of How I Became a Tree, in spite of the fact that they were all very kind to me and the book, I stopped reading them because I used to sweat. I'm a very timid person. I grew up with a very angry father. So I just heard the sound of my father's voice when I would read the reviews, that I would be scolded or, perhaps beaten if something I had said in the book was wrong. And I did not want to go through that emotion over and over again. So now when there are bad reviews, I have friends who tell me, oh, you got a bad review in the Hindu. And for me, a bad review is as good or as bad as a bad review. It's almost so, because I teach creative writing and because the founders of the program at Ashoka University, it was created by Shoykot Majumdar, who uses the Iowa school model, which is the feedback model. It's a model that I don't take naturally to, and I tell my students that I do not believe in the feedback model because I don't show my work to anyone. I just send it to the editor, or most often I am submitting it on my submittable form, where there are 97 rejections and 3 acceptances. The only feedback model that I work towards is when I'm cooking and I'm pestering my parents or my husband or my father-in-law to say, "Kemun hoyeche, bhalo hoyeche?" I mean, how is it? Is it good? I'm forcing them to say good. So that is the only feedback model when I'm cooking. Otherwise, I really don't care for it. But also Mandakini and Parveen said this about continuing. Let's start from here. Let us write about each other's work as if we don't know each other. Then we'll be able to be honest. Let us begin. And I am completely with you, Mandakini and Parveen and everyone else. Smita, yeah.
How do you, yeah, you wrote 2 reviews for my books.
Yes.
2 good reviews, not bad reviews.
It didn't matter to me that I knew you on Facebook, Ravi. I was just responding to the writing. It's the first time I've heard your voice, as you know. I mean, I have been in touch with Mandakini, with Shruti, with Parveen on Facebook, but I've never heard the sound of their voice. I want to protect myself from this dishonesty. I am sure, given the kind of emotional person I am, if I become very emotionally invested in them, I will, even if I don't like something in their writing, I will not be able to tell them. And I want to protect myself from that. Yeah.
How do you respond to this segregation of poetry? Now you know there are several kinds of poetry coming in, like Dalit poetry. Chandramohan is there. Dalit poetry, then feminist poetry. You don't seem to go into any of those. You have your own world to deal with. But how do you look at those kinds of poems?
They're very necessary. How do I say it without sounding condescending? Because that's the upper class and upper caste thing. That, you know, the fact that we even have to comment on it. I mean, Chandramohan doesn't tell us that, you know, whether our poetry should exist or not. We don't, just because he's, you know, he and his people for centuries have been deprived of the right to say anything about the things that we have been writing. You know, feminists have had to make a space for our writing. The fact that I can say all the things that I am at this moment owes to decades and decades and perhaps centuries of very hard work and sacrifice by by our feminist sisters and mothers. Similarly, with Chandramohan's writing, and the categorization exists so that there will be a point of time when these categories will not be important. One slot I do not like is when my writing is slotted under nature or environment, because that's not something I'm writing about at all. I hate this category, and I'm saying this. I'm not a person who usually. I don't think I've ever hated a person in my life or hated anything. I'm trying to think of a vegetable whose taste I might not like, but even then, I don't hate any vegetable. But yeah, I absolutely hate the category nature writing, because by saying nature, it tries to make a distinction between the human and what exists outside it. For me, nature is this plant behind me and myself together in the same space. This idea of nature as a weekend activity comes to us, you know, as something, as a scrapbook activity. As you know, you go to experience nature to a resort, to quote unquote a Vedic village and so on, is a hand me down from an American understanding of nature. Every kind of writing should be considered as writing about the environment, whether you are writing about plant life or not, animal life or not. I don't like these distinctions, and I never write from them. Also, the poems that I read for you, as you would understand, all of you, and How I Became a Tree, do not come from this place called environment or nature writing. They come from emotions. The moment we say save trees, because it's such a ready-made phrase and a cliche, our brain goes to sleep. And no one, I don't think any of us has saved a plant or a tree just because we happen to read this bureaucratic instruction called save trees. I think if we are able to replace the bureaucratic vocabulary around plant and animal life and replace it with a vocabulary of intimacy, the way you speak about your 999 imaginary girlfriends, Ravi, if we are able to bring that sense of intimacy into talking about plant life, animal life, my cell phone, a book, anything, that intimacy is what I'm aiming for in my writing.
Great.
I've just been blabbering.
Deepak, how much time we have got? I think 1 hour is over.
If Sumana ma'am is fine, we could take it till 5 o'clock.
Deepak?
Okay, but I'm sure all of you will be bored by then.
Okay. Like 2 hours is the maximum time that we thought of. As far as the speaker is convenient, like we can sit. That's what. So,
Okay, Ravi, you decide.
No, there are more questions from others. Let them ask.
Okay.
Sumana ma'am, I have a question.
Yes, Deepak.
Yeah, I would like to know a little more about My Mother's Lover and Other Stories that was published recently.
Okay, thank you. Everyone seems to have forgotten about that book, including myself and my mother. But thank you for remembering. These are stories that, because there are so many women whose names I see, I wanted to say this. I hope you don't mind my saying this in a slightly convoluted way, Deepak. I came to writing very late in my life. I'm 46 years old now. I began writing only in my early 30s when I was working towards a PhD. I used to get bored in the evenings. I was living with my husband at that point of time. He was teaching in Germany, and spending all my time during the day working on my PhD, at least pretending to work on my PhD, like so many doctoral students do. We rarely work, we pretend to be working. In the evenings, I longed for something else. It was the sound of my language. There was no Skype then, or even if there was, I didn't know of it. Phone calls were expensive. I missed the sound of Bangla very much. Twice or thrice a week when I spoke to my mother, that was the only time I got to hear and speak in Bangla, except from what I was speaking, except from speaking to my husband. And I began writing because there was a fabulous library at the Kulturwissenschaftliche Institute where my husband was working. I could access a lot of books in Bangla. And I began reading Bangla in a way that I hadn't before. Because of my ICSC education, ICSC and I had only ICSC and ISC Bangla, which had kind of driven me away from being really invested in literature in that particular language. It was then, around when I was 31 or 32, on the verge of submitting my PhD, that I began writing. My first story was about, so what happened was that, like a good Bengali girl, pretending to be a good Bengali girl working on her PhD, I kept my writing, or my initial forays into writing, a secret from my parents and also my husband, though he got to know before my parents did, certainly. So the secretive nature of writing made me imagine the figure of a mother who had kept her writing a secret from her children and her husband, her entire family. It also reminded me of 19th century Victorian novelists or 19th century women in general who had been forced to hide behind a pseudonym. Why had they, and I had also been reading with my students just before that this wondrous book called The Mad Woman in the Attic, about the signification or, the analogical understanding of women, writers as mad women, and so on. I was also thinking about Emily Dickinson, the need for a woman writer. I was thinking of the Bengali writer, Ashapurna Devi, who, after putting her entire family to sleep in the afternoon, would, crouch to inside her bed and write there, and write some of the most beautiful books ever written in the Bengali language. I was thinking of many of these figures of women writers, and my story, My Mother's Lover, came from that place. I will not exactly say who the lover in the story is. That was my first published story. It was it was published in a journal that I really, really liked from those times. It was called Pratilipi. It was a bilingual journal. It had the ambition to be a polylingual journal. So these stories. This was the first story, and this is a collection of stories I've written since then. They cover many aspects of things that I have thought about. Ravi mentioned the creative and the critical. Again, I think of the short story as being as essayistic as the essay is a space for storytelling. So there are these transgressions between genres in these stories. There's a story called My Mother's Head, which is based on my mother's life. My mother faces a lot of difficulty walking, and what that has done to her body and her mind. I think I will never be able to write fiction again. I don't feel very close to the form anymore, particularly fiction in English. But I also find that I am filled with the urge to write about my mother and women like my mother very, very often. And for this, I find the vehicle of the short story very helpful. It allows me to do things that perhaps the novel, the novella, or the essay does not allow me to do. Because you also mentioned this, Deepak, something that I have noticed while teaching in Ashoka is so many of the girls in my class, I notice in the last 1.5 semesters, have been writing poems and stories and letters to their grandmothers and mothers. I think it's a tradition that is beginning to evolve in Indian English writing, a new kind of sisterhood that I hope will become a very strong literary tradition.
Thank you, ma'am. I was also wondering, as you were speaking right from the beginning, there is something missing, okay? A feel of something missing. And that is when I immediately thought of the other book that we didn't discuss much, Missing a Novel. So probably if you could reflect on that too.
Thank you again, Deepak. Missing is a novel. The novel here in this case is the publisher's category. It's not something that I would have liked to call my quote unquote book. It came from a place I did not set out, like How I Became a Tree, which became a book. Only I had a very difficult commute, Deepak. I had to travel up to 6 to 7 hours every day from Shiliguri, where I am at this moment, to the college where I was teaching at that point of time. And whether I was traveling in a car or public transport, trains or buses, I found that I was always making notes on the phone. And only around 2014 or so did I find that the notes were accumulating in a way that I thought had a certain structure. That is how I Became a Tree emerged. Much before that, I had begun working in the summer, in July of 2012, what would become Missing. It did not have this name then. At that point of time, Missing is about 7 days in the life of a certain group of people in a small town that is Shiliguri. from the 24th of July 2012 to the 30th of July 2012. Ramzan is going on. A carpenter has come to an upper class house where he's making a bed. He has a Muslim helper whose name is Ahmed. And at that particular point of time, how do I say it? At that particular point of time, there are riots in Lower Assam. There is a flood in Assam. And just before that, a week or two before that, a girl has been molested in Guwahati. And all the things that I'm telling you are from newspaper reports. I have not made up anything. So that is why I was reluctant to call it a novel as well. A girl was molested in Guwahati. Journalists and people around, citizen journalists if you must, they had taken videos and photos of this happening, and they had circulated this almost in a pornographic manner, but they had not come forward to help this girl. And I was struck by how much of this was happening, and yet I had friends, not friends, but I knew acquaintances who were working for CNN, IBN, and NDTV, and the Telegraph, and the Statesman, and the Hindu, and all these English language newspapers, sitting in Delhi and Calcutta and other metropoles, and were reporting about this from these cities. So Bimolda, who happens to be our carpenter, was coming every day to our house where he was making a bed for us. And he was reporting things which had absolutely no relation or resemblance to what CNN, IBN, and NDTV and everyone else was telling us. For the first time in my life, and this was the summer of 2012, I encountered what would come to be known as fake news. So fake news is not only something that others are making, that fake news was something that, quote unquote, print and media journalism was creating too. And in this way that I found disgusting. So I began writing this on the 24th of July. What I did was I would just record what Bimolda and the house help coming to our house was saying about how people from Lower Assam who had been affected by the riots in Lower Assam and the floods were leaving those towns and cities and villages and were walking towards Shiliguri and other parts of North Bengal. I say walking because trains were stranded. And, I began taking notes for these 7 days. And then I didn't know how to write. I was very angry. And a week after that, when I was collecting the newspapers, I just happened to notice the headline on the 30th of July 2012. And my notebook was with me. And I found a great dissonance between what was the headline of the newspaper and what was in my notebook. And at that point of time, it came to me that I'm going to construct these two realities, one in fiction and one through the newspaper, and leave it to the reader to decide what was actually fiction. So I was giving them quote unquote news of the day, and simultaneous with that, from the Telegraph newspaper. So how did I do that? I tried to do that by inventing 3 characters. Apart from that, all the characters in the book are quote unquote real life people that I know. So here is a blind poet, his wife called Kobita, which is also the word for poetry or a poem. Kobita goes missing, and the blind poet wants to keep track of her by asking the carpenter's granddaughter to read the newspaper for her. For him, sorry. And so the girl called Tushi, she reads the newspaper in English, and we know nothing about this woman. It's also structured on the conceit of what happens, the reason I called it missing, what happens when a woman goes missing. It struck me that our epics, whether it was Sita or whether it's Troy, when the women go missing, people go to war, kings go to war. Kingdoms go to war, countries go to war. What happens when you place such a situation in the 21st century in a small town? So that was the intellectual conceit behind bringing, all these elements or thoughts together. So just as we have 7 kandas of the Ramayana, I tried to narrow it down to what HD called the diminished epic. When HD said, the modernist poet said, we cannot have an epic after this. So what we will always have is the diminished epic. So instead of the 7 kandas, I had 7 days, in the last week of July in missing. So that's what the book is about.
Thank you, ma'am. One last question from my side.
Okay.
I was very curious to know, to understand why you chose not to publish Love in the Chicken's Neck, though it was longlisted in Man Asian Literary Prize.
Because it was a terrible manuscript. Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't want to read. I realized, so that was the time, Deepak, when I had just started writing. And, then I had the sense that everything was inside me and I needed to get it out. So it was written very fast. I was in Shiliguri. I did not know anyone in Delhi. I did not have a literary agent. I still don't. I didn't know a single publisher. So then I got to know of this prize from Jay Arjun's blog, Jay Arjun Singh's blog, that a prize had been created for unpublished manuscripts. So I hurriedly sent 3 chapters that I had written, and it happened to be longlisted. Then in a rush, I tried to finish the manuscript, which I did. But it's not a book. When the time came when publishers and also agents later approached me for the manuscript, I realized that it wasn't a book that should be published. I feel that about many things that I have written after that too. But that I'm very grateful wasn't, and I'm very grateful that it wasn't published. If I don't like reading it, how can I expect someone outside myself to be reading it? Robert Frost said, uh, no, no joy in the reader, or no delight in the writer, no delight in the reader. So when I was reading it while trying to edit it, I didn't find any delight in it. So it might have looked good on my CV. Oh, she had one more book, or her first book was longlisted. But no, it was a bad book. I'm so grateful. I had that common sense, the element of common sense not to publish it.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am. Chandramohanji, do you have any more questions?
I've already asked my question. I've already asked my question.
Okay, fine. So in which case, if the participants do not have any more questions, we could take to, there is a question from Parveen Sarkar. Sumana, if you don't mind, could you throw some light on the idea of guilt-lipped you discussed about in your flower essay?
Again, Parveen, so grateful that you remember. Thank you. What I meant, this is something that I had been observing for some time. Most of us, I would say, if I have to put a percentage on this, I would say 99% of us who write, who have had access to English in some way or the other, are not underprivileged, are not quote unquote poor in any way, particularly in places that I come from. If you've had access to English medium education like I have had, I might have been deprived of many other things, but certainly if my parents had the money, however difficult it might have been to send me to an English medium school, they could not have been quote unquote poor. Now, something that has come to South Delhi publishing, or Anglophone publishing in India, I think is the idea of guilt-lit, and it is not something that originated here. I think it originated in upper class left America, where places, post-colonies like ours, quote unquote, marginalized societies like ours, are supposed to feed their guilt. This I see, Parveen, as a continuation of how America with the CIA sponsoring its area studies, as you know, how when area studies began, it was simulated. It was meant to look like an anthropological curiosity about cultures outside America, and all of us know how illiterate America is about cultures outside America. Um, there's also a power hierarchy happening there, where I, sitting in Shiliguri, was supposed to know what a donut tasted like, but we would have to explain what a dosa was or what sambar was. So the hierarchies over there, or what rasam was, for instance. The area studies, what it did was, I think, at least in my understanding, what it did was it gave birth to a kind of post-colonial literature, and let me limit myself to Indian writing in English, where writers felt compelled to write about the cultures that they were familiar with, hoping that they would be published in the West. What the West wanted was a festival of India kind of approach to literature, where we were supposed to be Travel and Living or The Lonely Planet, giving them, taking a camera or a lens into our cultures. Anything that stood outside this, if you were writing about your mother, for instance, it was of no interest to them because it would not satisfy their curiosity or their appetite for cultures. This have turned literature departments into almost, how do I say it, outposts of sociology or anthropology departments. This began, at least in my understanding, this began to morph into such a way where the only kind of literature that is being published outside India, or largely published outside India, owe to quote unquote apocalyptic literature. If you write about, a cyclone, only that kind of literature related to environment studies from India will be published. If Manoranjanda writes about being marginalized, only that would be published. What this is doing is, while we don't realize it, and I'm sure we will realize it very soon, is it makes a writer like Chandra Mohan write about himself, write about his people, only in a way that satisfies the appetite of the West. That is killing one aspect of our writing. That, people most affected by this would be women writing about experiences that are often not written about in Anglophone spaces. Or women's writing traditionally has been dismissed as insignificant literature. Insignificant in quotes, those words are not mine. So women's literature does not have to do with the nation, is not a representation of a certain group of people, and so on and so forth. So anything that is non-representative of a large community, and a kind of literature that is not giving voice again is there, is a publisher's category to their understanding of the marginalized, is something that they are not interested in. You look up the post-colonial syllabus in any American university, Ravi's work will not be studied there because it doesn't come from their understanding of the marginalized. So this is hampering, or this has affected the way Anglophone publishing in India is working as well. What this has done is it is creating a body of what I think is a slightly dishonest literature. I want to write about this, in greater detail in the future, Parveen. I think there was another question.
He has wishes to know what is the significance of Buddha in your poems and writings.
I think he's my favorite person, along with a couple of others. He's my favorite person from history. His writings have, so I don't really read him as a quote unquote spiritual thinker. Uh, it would be good on me if I could, good for me too. But I just see him as an extremely critical thinker, um, who's telling us things, whose teachings are valid even now. And that is not, whose words have not dated. They mean a lot to me. Yes. I think someone else asked a question, Mandakini's name, but I couldn't see the question.
She was asking, what are you working on at present?
Okay. That's a hard question to answer. I have been working on something that I have in my head called the Provincial Reader, Mandakini. It is about, again, it comes from very personal space. I have felt, how do I say this without sounding shameless? I'm sorry if I'm sounding slightly cheap. I have noticed that particularly in the provinces, but through most of English departments throughout India, even in the metropoles. And I know, Mandakini, you don't live in India for very long now, so you might not completely understand the phenomenon that I'm talking about. But many of us who have had to bear the brunt of this kind of new English that is being imposed on us, it is a mishmash. Hybridity is too glorious a term for that. It is a mishmash of a language, of a kind of Esperanto that is being spoken, that is spoken in English language departments in the last 10 or 20 years, now 2 decades, in the new millennium, which is a rehash, a crazy rehash of Foucault, Derrida, some of the Anglo-American critical thinkers and critical theorists, a bit of Deleuze. It's like making papri chaat of or jhalmuri of all the thinkers on the syllabus. So what this has done is something really dangerous. It has created a people, a generation, not only of students, but of teachers who speak and write like this, for whom, although they belong to literature departments, there is absolutely no interest in the literary, no interest in language, which is what we are working with. I never think of myself as a writer. As I always say, I think of myself as a bhasha karmi, a language worker. There is nothing that is taught about language. Students are rarely taught how to write. So what we have is, derivative criticism being taught, and all of that being brought together to produce a language which is not only incomprehensible, but which is certainly going to give you a headache. So what I'm trying to, it began with an essay that I wrote earlier this year to question how did this come about, because that is not how my generation studied. The reasons behind this, the power equations that attend this, and yes, absolutely. So if you don't, so when I mentioned when someone calls you a mere poet, you are a poet because you don't speak that kind of language. You don't write that kind of language. So how did this come to be? How has it affected our literature? How has it affected our reading habits? How has it affected publishing? So all of this. In my head, I've called this the provincial reader, Mandakini. Ayushi's question, how do you define good literature? Anything that moves me and gives me delight. Anything. Absolutely anything. It could be a very nice an interesting comment in the chat box. That is literary enough for me. However, I've been thinking of the idea of the literary, and I think it's a very Brahminical concept, and I'm going to write about it very soon. How the idea of the literary was formed in cultures like ours.
RaSh, so I'd like to bring, that poem of Shyam Sudhakaran to your attention. So, maybe you
Yes,
could read
please.
it out or ask him to read it. Like, he has a poem inspired by a poem of Sumana. So maybe that's a rare honor.
Yes, I'd be very, very happy to listen to this.
Rash?
You want me to read it?
Yeah, or ask Sham to read it, or maybe
Yeah,
you can read it.
I think Shyam is there. I saw him
Okay.
coming in.
Okay.
Is Shyam there?
I think he left in between.
Yeah. If he isn't there, you could read it.
Margaret's Deck. Shyam Sudhakar. He has translated Sumana's poem. മാർഗരറ്റ് വെളുത്ത ഓർക്കിഡുകളുടെ നാടായ കർസോങ് താഴ്വരയിലെ ക്രൂയിക്ഷാങ് സായിപ്പിന്റെ ചായത്തോട്ടത്തിലേക്ക് ഒരിക്കൽ മാത്രം വന്ന മകൾ മടങ്ങി വരാം എന്ന വാക്ക് പാലിക്കാനാവാതെ കപ്പലിൽ രോഗം മൂർച്ഛിച്ചു മരിച്ചവൾ. മകളുടെ വേർപാടിൽ തകർന്ന ക്രൂയിക്ഷാങ് തന്റെ തോട്ടത്തിന് മാർഗരറ്റ്സ് ഹോപ്പ് എന്ന് പേരിട്ടു. പശ്ചിമ ബംഗാളിലെ തേയില തൊഴിലാളി സമരങ്ങളുടെ തുടക്കവും ഇവിടെ നിന്ന്. കുന്നുകയറുമ്പോൾ റോഡിൽ നിന്നും ഇല്ലായ്മയുടെ നിറവിലേക്ക് തള്ളിയാണ് മാർഗരറ്റ്സ് ഡെക്ക് എന്ന ചായമാടത്തിന്റെ നിൽപ്പ്. സുമന റോയ് എന്ന ബംഗാളി കവിയുടെ ഒരു കവിതയിൽ മാർഗരറ്റ് ഡെക്ക് ഹിമപർവ്വതങ്ങളിലേക്ക് നിറയൊഴിക്കാൻ കാത്തു നിൽക്കുന്ന ഒരു തോക്ക്. കടൽ കടക്കാനാവാതെ പക്ഷം കുഴഞ്ഞ് ഉപ്പായി മാറിയ ഇളം കാറ്റിന്റെ കണ്ണുകൾക്ക് ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ ഹൃദയം കൈമാറുന്നു. ആ ഇടത്ത് നിങ്ങൾക്കൊരു തോക്കായി ഉപമിക്കാനാവില്ല. ആ ഇടത്തെ നിങ്ങൾക്കൊരു തോക്കായി ഉപമിക്കാനാവില്ല. കുന്നിന് മുകളിലുള്ള റോഡിൽ നിന്നും ശൂന്യതയിലേക്ക് കൈനീട്ടുന്ന ഒരു ചായനാടത്തിന്റെ നിൽപ്പ്. അകലെ ഹിമാലയത്തിന്റെ ഒരു കീറ്. ശിഖരങ്ങളിൽ നിന്ന് മേഘങ്ങളിലേക്ക് ഏതു നിമിഷവും പെട്ടേക്കാവുന്ന ഒരു പക്ഷിയുടെ ഇരിപ്പ്. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വൃദ്ധനായ ഒരു കരടിയുടെ തേനിലേക്കുള്ള അവസാനത്തെ ഏന്തൽ. സ്വർഗത്തിലേക്കുള്ള വഴിയിൽ കടപുഴകിയിട്ടും മറിഞ്ഞു വീഴാത്ത ഒരു വൃക്ഷം. കൂടെയുള്ള 5 പേരെയും വിട്ട് ഞാനും ഒരിക്കൽ വ്രണങ്ങളുടെയും വീഴ്ചകളുടെയും ചരിത്രം തേടിപ്പോയിരുന്നു. കപ്പിൽ നിന്ന് ഇലകളിലേക്കും വേരുകളിലേക്കും തൊഴിലാളികളിലേക്കും നിഷ്പ്രയാസം പോകുന്ന പഴയ കവികളെപ്പോലെ. നക്ഷത്രങ്ങളെ തമ്മിൽ കൂട്ടിയോജിപ്പിക്കുന്ന ഒരു ചിലന്തിയെപ്പോലെ. ആത്മാവിനെ നെഞ്ചുകീറി പറത്തി കുന്നുകളിൽ ചേക്കേറാൻ വിട്ടിരുന്നു. എന്നാൽ ഇന്ന് ഈ അടഞ്ഞ മുറിയിലിരുന്ന് നിങ്ങളുടെ കവിത വായിക്കുന്നു മകൾ നഷ്ടപ്പെട്ട ഒരച്ഛൻ. അവളുടെ പഠനമേശയിൽ നിന്ന് പുസ്തകങ്ങൾ പുറത്തേക്ക് അല്പം തള്ളി നിൽക്കുന്നത് കാണുമ്പോൾ ഒഴിഞ്ഞ കപ്പിലേക്ക് നിസ്സഹായത വരിവരിയായി അരിച്ചു നീങ്ങുമ്പോൾ ഓർക്കുന്നു, ആ ഇടം ഞങ്ങൾക്കൊരിക്കലും തിര നിറഞ്ഞ ഒരു തോക്കായിരുന്നില്ല എന്ന്. So that was the poem by Sumana, translated by Shyam Sudhakar, who is himself a poet. He writes in English also.
Thank you so much.
I think that's all, Deepak, for today.
Yes, sir.
I think Sumana is very tired.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir. Sir, if we could listen to one poem by you to close the event, that would be great. Something that's written by you. And if you have one to recite now.
Let me see. I have to look into my PC. 1 second.
So probably we'll end our session with that reading. So as he's closing the, as he's picking on the poem that he may read to us, I would formally like to extend my sincere gratitude to Sumana Roy ma'am, as well as RaSh sir, for having joined us and accepted our invitation at short notice. Thank you very much. On behalf of Team Ideas in Progress, Padasala, as well as all our participants and our curator, Mr. Chandramohan, I extend our sincere gratitude to you, ma'am, as well as sir. Thank you and hope to meet you again and listen to you further. And I hope all these participants would join us tomorrow. We have Needu Das ma'am and Somrita Ganguly ma'am with us tomorrow. Somrita ma'am in conversation with Needu Das. Thank you all. Now I hand over the session to RaSh sir to read out his poem and formally conclude it. Thank you.
Yeah. Sumana, I will come and meet you in Siliguri.
Yes, please.
After this virus goes away, there are at least 3 poets from there I want to meet.
Okay.
Momita Alam and Ritambara.
Okay.
So I'll read it. Somebody asked this question about Buddha and how Buddha, how much Sumana is concerned with Buddha. I'll read out a poem about Buddha that I wrote. Buddha and Biryani. When Buddha awoke from his psychotropic trance, the analyst who had hypnotized him asked, "How do you feel now, Lord? Are you free from the clutches of karma?" Before replying, Buddha's nostrils flared. He asked, "What is that heavenly scent assailing my senses?" The psycho sniffed the air like a police dog and said, "That is biryani, my lord." The famished lord said, "Ah, let me taste some of that heavenly stuff before exiting this damn cycle of food and feces." In gastronomic fervor, the Lord transmigrated on a long foodie trip to all parts of the globe. He relished biryani with saji kebab in Kabul, yak wraps in Lhasa, kukul mas curry in Colombo, Silong Tang in Korea, Gyukshi in Japan, Kapro in Thailand, Amok Tre in Thailand, Nguyen Hinga in Myanmar. Satiated and saliva dripping from his inflamed tongue, he lay down to sleep in a sala grove after a meal of pork offered by a blacksmith. In delirium, he dreamt of partaking dal bath tarkari in the kitchen of Yasodhara. Then 9 months pregnant, he attained parinirvana in his gastroenteritic slumber. Wherever he had eaten, his faith spread, as he had commanded his disciples to eat whatever they got as alms from the people. Therefore, Ananda, in the cycle of life and death, there is no right food and wrong food. The cannibals know that best. So that was the poem, Buddha and Biryani. Thank you all. Thank you, Sumana, for being here. Thank you, Deepak, for organizing it. And thank you, Chandramohan, for getting me, dragging me into this. Thanks, everyone who attended. Sumana,
Thank you, everyone. Please stay well and please take care. I hope we meet all of you. I hope to meet all of you in person someday. Please take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we close the session. I hope all of you would join us tomorrow at same time, 3 p.m. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.